Thank you so much, and thank you so much for the organizers of Art Basel Conversations, who are by far the best organizers in the art world. So, right? Okay, thank you. So I'm going to give brief introductions because as we continue to talk, you'll get to know more about each panelist. And there's also more lengthy bios in the Art Basel materials. So we have Jose Diaz, who's the chief curator of the Andy Warhol Museum and a longtime resident of Miami. We have Mitra Abbaspour, who is a scholar of contemporary Middle Eastern art and a curator with a special emphasis on photography. She's done some curatorial work at MoMA. And we have Dina Nasser Khadivi, who is the diva of the Middle Eastern art world. She is, I think, based in Geneva, but is hardly ever there because she's always traveling throughout the Middle East and Europe and America. And she's an art advisor and consultant and also does curatorial and scholarly work. So this is who our speakers are today. And I thought I'd start off with Jose because the impetus for our talk is a show that he's curated at the Andy Warhol Museum. It's an exhibition by the Iranian artist Farhad Moshiri. Farhad Moshiri is trained at Cal Arts, lived in America for over a decade, but was born and raised in Iran, and since the late 80s, early 90s, has been consecutively living and working in Iran. One of the most commercially successful contemporary Middle Eastern artists, but Jose's curated his first museum exhibition, first solo museum exhibition. So, Jose, could you tell us a little bit about why you chose to curate Farhad Moshiri as your first major show at the Andy Warhol Museum?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for moderating, Shiva. Yeah, my name is Jose Diaz. I'm from Miami. I was formerly the curator at the Basel Museum, which just reopened. And actually, before the Basel closed for its renovation, we had a large exhibition that I organized with the collection of Peter Marino. He actually, I think, in the United States has the largest groupings of Moshiri's work. And so for that particular exhibition, I was not familiar with the artist. I was familiar with the beaded paintings that I would see randomly through the Paraton Gallery, through the art fairs. But it was the first time that I saw his work sort of clustered together, and we had done a commission. It was a wall phrase that said "Paradise," and it was on the wall, and it was conceptually, shipped as a box of knives, and we installed it on the wall. And so when I left the Basel Museum and interviewed for the Warhol, I had to pitch shows that I would do if I was to be hired. And Moshiri was interesting because I had formally associated him as being purely pop, and a lot of that had to do with the way he was sort of branded by the media and by the galleries and even by the scholarship. And then I realized, secondly, that he had never had a museum exhibition in the United States, a solo, and so that's when I had reached out not only to the galleries, but then Dina got involved, and scholars started to say, oh, this is an artist worth looking into. And I realized the importance of doing the show. And of course, we're not as nimble as we'd like to be, but we committed to the show when I first started at the Warhol, and now the world has changed a bit. So that's how I started working with him.
That's interesting. So you've now had the context of curating the same artist in a solo show and in a group show. And here in Miami, around the time of Art Basel, where there's a more global community, and in the Andy Warhol Museum, which is very much in Pittsburgh. And I think when we think about the Andy Warhol Museum, we tend to think of it as a very kind of cosmopolitan, global institution, which it is, but it's also in Pittsburgh, which is a very Western Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is a purple state, voted for Trump. So it's a very specific context in which this Iranian artist is being shown. So if you could talk a little bit about the difference in curating it in these two different American contexts.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating that the exhibition, it opens with two paintings that one of them is called Yippee. It has like a howdy doody sort of character on a little go-kart, and I wanted people to find themselves in the work, and I thought I'd start the show off with sort of the motif of the cowboy. So the first two works, it's Yippee, and it's in this slideshow above, and there's another one that's sort of a appropriated image of a saloon, like a bar brawl. And the work is from 2010, and it's called America, and I thought it was so moving. And doing it in Pittsburgh, it's interesting because about 70% of our audience at the Warhol Museum is tourists. So it's actually people that are not Pittsburghers, it's out-of-town people. And they really come to see Andy Warhol. So this exhibition was really important to bring because most of our visitors would come to see Andy Warhol and assume that Moshiri is a pop artist and not know his biography, his background. And so as people see the images, they're familiar, but then they realize, especially with the earlier work in the show, that this artist lives in the Middle East. This content, this imagery is actually from his own background, his own exposure to not only living in Iran, but also living in the United States. And so it's interesting because people come for the legacy of Warhol, but then now they've been introduced to a new artist. And I think with the Pittsburgh audience, it's interesting because we can also program, and that was really important for this particular exhibition. When we had the talk with you in Pittsburgh, it was a real interesting because the audience, there's an assumption that everyone is going to love the work, and that's not typically the case. And then Farhad's work has so many different layers underneath. It's not just about the whimsy that you see on the beaded canvases. So I was surprised to take an artist from Tehran, show him in Pittsburgh, and then, you know, he's read differently here in the marketplace here at the Art Basel Fair.
That's very interesting. Dina, I remember a lunch you and I had in Little Italy in New York years ago when you were emphatic over a big plate of pasta that you were going to do a book about Farhad Moshiri because you felt that all we talked about was his market success and kind of the euphemism of the Iranian Andy Warhol, and that you felt that there was more there. And you ended up publishing a beautiful 2-volume book on Farhad Moshiri. So what about Farhad Moshiri made you want to dig in and put him in a different perspective?
So, I mean, Farhad was an artist that I actually came across a little over a decade ago. I'm Iranian myself, but never lived in Iran. And when I originally saw his work, it was through the time when I worked at Christie's. And I thought, you know, funny enough, the work that we initially saw was this map of Iran, which doesn't reflect really his practice because his practice is so diverse and he works in so many different medias. But long story short, in the past decade, he's an artist who I thought was always so interesting for a variety of reasons. The way he worked, his practice, his approach to his media, his background, his training, the fact that he decided to go back to Iran, his imagery. But more importantly, he had a very unusual evolution because he sort of became instantly recognized through the art market and at auction first before he got his gallery representation with really good galleries now. But basically what happened is he became very commercially successful, and then it's as if, you know, he was always branded as this artist who made $1 million, but nobody really looked at his practice from a, you know, from an academic perspective or from a scholarly approach. And it was important for me to do this book first for people to understand that his work goes beyond the aesthetics, but also because his practice, interestingly enough, if you look at a survey of his work over 20 years like I did, you'll see that if you go, for instance, to a gallery show, his later gallery shows do stick to one series, but otherwise, he's someone who's so diverse in his approach to his subject matter and how he works. A lot of people are like, wow, this guy did this work, I'm so fucking happy, but then he also did this jar. How is that even possible? And it's just about really showing and mapping his evolution over 20 years and sort of connecting the dots, because he did sort of go back to a lot of different themes over time, and his media and his evolution are something that I thought were fascinating, because he's also an artist who, you know, deliberately decided to go back to Iran and who actually was truly inspired by what was happening in post-revolutionary Iran, yet decided not to take a political approach to his work, which is very rare within the contemporary group of artists we have. And not that it's right or wrong, it's just that it's very interesting because he ended up sort of he recorded all these things that nobody else saw or cared to see necessarily because they were so focused on other aspects of post-revolutionary Iran, which were also really relevant. But for me, this book was really about trying to explain his evolution, why he decided to work the way he did, how he reinvented himself over and over again throughout, 20 years over all these different I mean, the amount of media this guy uses is just insane. It's amazing. And his work is very tactile, but it's also so interesting when you think of why he uses the media he does. And without getting too much into detail, because we can discuss it later, but that was what was really fascinating for me. And I tried to put that through this book by doing a thematic approach and then doing a chronological survey of his work. But if you look at his work chronologically only, nobody would understand.
Yeah.
Only, yeah.
I think it's really important. And, you know, when you know kind of the Cal Arts ethos, you know, the kind of the really intellectualized, conceptual, highly experimental, formally experimental work, it helps you to understand his art in a very different perspective. I think most people tend to think of Farhad Moshiri as an Iranian artist, but that Cal Arts training, I think, is a really important context. And then he actually studied film. He was going to be a filmmaker. And soon after the Iran-Iraq war ended in 1989, he went back to Iran and decided to stay there. And so he brought kind of this insider-outsider perspective to Iran. You know, someone who had been born and raised there, was fluent in the culture, but had been absent from it for a long time. And he also brought that very kind of conceptual, experimental Cal Arts view. And you kind of, Mitra, you've written about how some of his early work from that period, when he first went to Iran, you define it as Rococo revolutionary, because he has a very kind of ethnographic, architectural approach to some of the art that he made. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Sure. Because of the inclination to associate Farhad's work with pop art, in part because it appropriates and it collages together cartoon imagery, slogans, logos, things that elements from everyday culture or mass-produced culture. I think that has lent itself. We have, of course, a very natural desire as humans to associate work that is new to us with something that is familiar to us, and pop art is an internationally familiar visual language. But what I was interested in was trying to place him back in the context of 1990s Iran, in this context that he arrived in from LA after what had been an incredible revolutionary turn in that country. And I think that was much more than a stylistic affinity. It was a historical comparison that I wanted to draw, that the Rococo comes out in France as the wealthy class, as the aristocrats, are redefining the language of wealth and redefining the language of luxury after the death of Louis XIV, a king who had called himself the Sun King, who had reigned for 3/4 of a century in an incredibly autocratic, singular way. And so when you think about 1989 or 1990s Iran, you're also looking at a country that is redefining its identity after a period of monarchy that lasted nearly a century, that a war that began on the heels of a revolution and took over a decade. And here, with the close of that war in 1989, the country is looking to redefine its language of culture, its language of wealth, its language of luxury, and it's that with the aesthetic of appropriation art, of sampling, of postmodern sampling of different elements of culture, but then to redefine, to react to that cultural context of 1990s Iran, of a country and a culture that's redefining its own identity and its own language of wealth, its own language of an aristocracy and luxury in the wake of a tremendously powerful revolution. That's the historical context that I was trying to situate him in, and to try to create a way that we could read his work and his practice of appropriation within the context where it was created.
That's very interesting. In fact, we have our catalog from the show, and we've all written essays for it. And I do talk about his notion of sampling that Farhad said he kind of appropriated from his studies of Nick Cage at CalArts, this notion that you could kind of take sampling from the musical world and apply it to the visual world. I think one of the things that's interesting about Farhad's work too is that we tend to talk about him in terms of Dubai as the market, because he became the first contemporary Middle Eastern artist to achieve $1 million for a painting at auction at Dubai, and so we tend to think of him in terms of the auctions at Dubai. But I think that there's also commentary that he makes about kind of Dubai and the glitz. And there's always this contrast between the surface and the glitter and the substance of his work. And there's also a contrast between a guy who makes very, very out there, glitzy art and an artist who's very reclusive. You know, he doesn't really promote himself too much. He doesn't hang out at art world parties. He kind of
doesn't answer his emails. Sorry, Farhad. Had to say that.
Farhad, answer your goddamn email. You know. So he's not into self-promotion. So there's these contradictions between the surface of his work, the substance of his work, the glitziness of the art world versus his own quiet. I mean, I think his favorite pastime is going to antique stores and finding knickknacks that he can incorporate into his art. So this became something that I really noticed, Jose, when I saw your show, because I've seen Farhad Moshiri's work in bits and pieces. You know, you see it at art fairs, you see it in group shows, but this is the first time I'd seen room after room of his art, and seeing it in real life versus seeing it as a JPEG, because that's one of the aspects of this new global art market, is we're inundated with images. You know, I arrived at Art Basel, Miami today, but I've seen half the fair on Instagram already. So this difference, this is another aspect of translated images, the JPEG art world versus the real art world, because his art looks so different in person. And I noticed at the Andy Warhol, people kept wanting to touch it. And I went on a Sunday morning, and this is another kind of, it shows my own biases, but I was surprised that on a Sunday morning, the Andy Warhol Museum was filled with white guys wearing football jerseys, because apparently it's right next to the stadium, and before you go to a Steelers game, you go to the Andy Warhol Museum. See, right? And I actually talked to them. I'm like, you know, Warhol Museum, and they were making fun of me. They're like, yeah, we're going to the ballet after the football game, you know. But could you talk a little bit about that? Because I know it's something you've really thought about, the tactileness of his work and the contrast between the surface and the substance.
Yeah, I think a lot of people who do know his work, it's mostly from the marketplace. It's the beaded paintings. And for this particular show, I had to work with, I worked with Dina really to find objects. The exhibition has 32 works, and 21 of the works are from Europe or the Middle East. It was a very expensive show to put together, and it took a village to actually make the show happen. But yeah, the exhibition, it really had to focus on through Warhol's eyes, I guess, or my eyes. I really wanted to focus on the checklist to embrace a lot of Farhad's early work, but also works that people were not familiar with. And the works are extremely tactile. People do want to touch them. We have a phrase, a wall phrase. It's like a pictogram. It's called mountains and rivers, so it looks like rolling hills. And then it says rivers, and it's one of his wall phrases. But it arrives as a box of just like hundreds of keychains, and it's just nails on the wall, and we just hang the keychains. And we didn't secure them, and none have been stolen. And Farhad gave us some exhibition extras, so we can swap them if we have to. But yeah, people are really amazed when they go to the museum and they see how beautiful. People do not realize when you see the beaded paintings that there's often mistakes. He works with a lot of female embroiderers who put the beads, but you'll find a random colored bead throughout. He sort of welcomes chance or error. And so you can't really see that when you're Instagramming, and the fair is so Instagrammable, and you know, certainly at the Warhol we get a lot of that. But I think when with this particular checklist, you know, we take Farhad's work from being very two-dimensional in the Instagram world, and we bring it and make it very dimensional, because one of the works in the show, it's 32 stacked rugs with a cutout of Tom from Tom and Jerry, The work is called Crash. We had a huge challenge bringing in a carpet piece. We had one stuck in Tunisia that never made it. But the carpet piece was really important because a lot of people were familiar with the Tom and Jerry cartoon. The rug piece has a projection of Tom the cat crashing through a ceiling. And actually it's one of the most widely internationally distributed cartoons in the world because of the lack of language. And so when people recognize Tom and Jerry, you know, the narrative is really focused on violence and humor, and that you see a lot of that in Farhad's work. I really wanted to take what one sees, I guess, on TV or on their phone and really bring it into the gallery in this really multidisciplinary way. And that's why the checklist had to focus on so many varieties and, you know, areas of Farhad's career, because people are not familiar with that. And for our audience, they come seeing Warhol, and they also find threads through that. But Warhol went to Iran in 76, I think, and so there was that sort of connection. We have lots of stuff in the archives from that visit. But yeah, I wanted this checklist to really show his range, because a lot of it gets lost if you only know his work through social media.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, because when I was doing research for my talk that you invited me to give, one of the things that kind of situated Andy Warhol as a global artist was actually his connection with Iran. And he was invited by the royal family to go to Tehran and take Polaroids of them because they wanted official Warhol portraits of the king, his twin sister, and the queen. And Warhol at that time, in the late 70s, had a declining market. And he imagined that every official government office in Iran would have Andy Warhol's depiction of the king, and he would make a lot of money off of this. And he went to Tehran, and he actually got a lot of backlash in America, because at that time there were protests against the Shah's regime, and he was considered as kind of aligned with a right-wing government. But so you have this contrast of this American artist who becomes defined as global partly through his interaction with Iran, and then you have an Iranian artist who relies on a lot of what we consider to be American imagery in his art. So it's actually this interesting dialogue that you get because of the way you've curated and how you've curated it. So tell us a little bit about why you decided to go with the theme Go West and kind of focus on the strain of Americana in Farhad Moshiri's art.
Yeah, the title is Go West, and, you know, geographically he's gone west. You know, we're in Southwest Pennsylvania. But the title also comes from a Marx Brothers film. Farhad Moshiri's father owned a chain of cinemas, and the cinemas specialize in different films, like kung fu films, and one of them focused on like Wild West films and the idea of going west. And the West is sort of this mythological place. You know, it's westward expansion. It's an unruly place. It's a place of adventure. And so, with Farhad's work and his time that when he grew up in California, he did go west, and he went to California. And so, this particular checklist wanted to sort of embrace this idea of going west with his content, because a lot of people don't realize he actually still lives in Tehran. And so people think it's an American artist, and this notion of the West is really important to him, because the cowboy can also, we interpret the cowboy as being ours, you know, the American cowboy. Andy Warhol, of course, has some, the Elvis paintings, of course, with that are his like cowboy paintings. But I think the idea of going west was really important for this show, because we're showing Farhad's dualities, and I think a lot of people have sort of these dual identities, and Farhad certainly does. And for this particular checklist, a lot of people were not familiar with like the jars, the cracked canvas jar paintings, and they also have Western influences, whether it's like a Farsi phrase that's taken from a pop song or a soap opera, and the work itself becomes familiar and unfamiliar, and I love that I sort of love the way Farhad creates this new hybrid of that, and he's able to appropriate from American culture or Western culture and also from his own, but actually both belong to him, and I think that's, you know, the idea of whose is it to use is kind of interesting.
Yeah, it's almost like it's dubbed art, the way movies can be dubbed. So, Dina, I wanted you to talk a little bit about this notion of kind of this global art circuit, because more than most of us, you actually do travel on a very regular basis between the Gulf and Europe, across Europe and across America. And you're familiar with major collectors of Farhad Moshiri in all, you know, and it's very actually rare in the art world. We talk about a global art market, but it's rare to find an artist who is eagerly and avidly collected in Europe, in America and in the Middle East. And he's collected within Iran and the Arab world also, which is, again, another rarity. So if you could talk a little bit about what is his appeal at such a broad level, and also what does that kind of global context, what does that do for our understanding of his imagery and his art?
So I think what's interesting with him is that he's an artist who, well, he's been quite prolific, but the fact that he has this hybrid nature between the fact that he was obviously trained in the US and went back to Iran, his imagery just translates and speaks to so many different cultures and people. There's a big element of humor in his work, which always obviously makes a lot of people smile. And also I think there is a big element of surprise when people see his work tends to be often qualified as being very happy or making people happy. So actually, Hadiya was telling me this the other day when I was at her studio. She's like, you know, I saw his show, and when I was looking at his work, it just made me so happy. So he often gets that, which is quite rare in the contemporary realm, because a lot of people used to like to, you know, shock or get really, you know, more into darker subjects. So for that, I think that the imagery and the aesthetic and the media he uses is something that a lot of people, it just appeals to a lot of people, and it also puzzles them. And they're like, what? This guy lives in Iran, and he's, you know, he makes every single topic that he touches, he turns into something happy. So, for instance, earlier we had these images flipping through. There was a fountain that he photographed in Kashan, which was, for example, a fountain that was for the armistice between Iraq and Iran. They made the water in the fountain red, sort of talk about the blood of the martyrs, etc. And he'll look at that and he'll think, oh, that reminds me of a cake. So then he'll make this cake, and then he'll say, oh, imagine if people actually had cake over the armistice of Iran and Iraq. And you're like, okay. But then he'll look at a building and he'll be like, again, cake. He has cake on the brain a lot. So it's very interesting because he ends up having this imagery that can be understood by so many different cultures, and in a different way by every person. So, even the image we're looking at now, for instance, which is a very iconic piece that he did that says only love in Farsi, this is actually a very important work in his practice because it's a pivotal work showing his transition from crack to crystal in his own practice, which is that he used to make all these works, these jars and these abjads, which were, his media was all about doing these cracked surfaces. And then he started incorporating this element of glitter, the Swarovskis, which was really to show that sort of post-revolutionary society that Mitra was also discussing earlier, this very ostentatious side of like the uptown Tehran, etc. But at the same time, a lot of people see this work, including a lot of Iranians, are like, oh, this is such a cool work, and it's, it's glittery, and it's about love. When in fact, it could be understood that way, but it's also, it has so many different layers of interpretation. And I think that's why he's developed a very global market, because a lot of people will just, appreciate his work for different reasons, and he embraces that. He loves that. He always tells me, I like people to just, have their own way of interpreting my work. And I think that's what's made him really international is that, yes, he's had all this market in the Middle East originally, and actually before he became really famous globally, he was already known in Iran. I mean, he had shown with Feridun Av. He already had, sold out shows with Fani and Hafiz jars.
And he was acquired by major museums. I mean, he had his first British museum acquisition before he achieved,
exactly.
So this is kind of the history of contemporary Middle Eastern artists, often falsely written. And the notion is that a decade ago, Christie started selling art in Dubai, Art Dubai started, and people became interested in contemporary Middle Eastern art. No, museums had long been collecting contemporary Middle Eastern art. Farhad Moshiri, Shirin Neshat, all those artists were already in major museum collections.
And in biennials.
And the art of our region was very much kind of a subject that curators like Thelma Golden and university professors were working on long before the art market in Dubai kind of happened. And in fact, in what his first piece that kind of broke an auction price is One World, which is a map of the world in blue and green that's got crystals all over it, hundreds of thousands of crystals. And it was kind of I've written about it as his take on kind of Tom Friedman's ridiculous notion of, the world is flat and we're all the same. But if you could talk a little bit, Mitra, about this notion of the way he kind of uses glitter and facade as actual social commentary on the flashy money aspect of the art world. And so it's not just about uptown Tehran glitter, it's about Dubai art market glitter, it's about Art Basel art market glitter, it's kind of commentary on the commercialization of art to some extent too.
Well, it's funny, I was thinking about our panel today when I was walking around yesterday, and we can look at this both cynically and optimistically. In my good days, I like to think of it very optimistically, but throughout history, luxury, aristocracy transcends law, transcends boundaries, transcends rules. And so some of the postdoc students I work with who are Persian and are here on student visas can't leave the country for fear that they can't get back in as individuals due to the current legal restrictions on entering and leaving as an Iranian citizen. And yet here at the art fair, we've got Dastan's basement at Untitled, we've got galleries from Tehran, we've got galleries from the Emirates, we've got galleries from New York. And so there's this way in which the luxury economy of the art market itself transcends the legal restrictions, the political biases, the laws that might restrict individuals. And on an optimistic note, I think there's something really incredibly powerful about that. I think it's powerful that we have galleries from Tehran showing alongside galleries from Buenos Aires, Valencia, and New York City, all in the same room, in the same fair. And I think that's something that Farhad is keenly aware of, has a sophisticated sense of the fact that he's poking and prodding at the very systems and economies and luxury aesthetic that may have a very specific geographic locale and may have a very specific political position, but aesthetically transcends all those boundaries for an economy of crystal, of glitter, of luxury, of glitz, of shine, and that in that realm, the economy of wealth has always been a global economy. Like, we're always looking, throughout history, empires and emperors and the aristocracy is always looking across boundaries to find the language of beauty, to the language of power, wow, the language of wealth.
That's quite a statement, and we'll kind of begin to wrap up our conversation a little bit and take comments and questions from the floor too. But one thing that, when I taught art history at Brown students really are as smart as their reputation. And they taught me a lot when I taught art. And one thing that they made me really think about is the market in a completely different way. So they reminded me that a market is a good thing because artists need to make a living. They reminded me that when people buy art, it gets seen and circulates. And they reminded me that galleries are the place that they tend to see art more. Art fairs and galleries. They said because first of all, galleries are free. You don't have to pay admission. And secondly, the transparency of the market at art fairs and galleries was comforting to them. They knew the work was for sale, they knew how much it was for sale. And they assumed that museums also were market-driven and had financial relationships, but that those were obscure and not as clear. And so my young kind of lefty Brown students were much more cynical about museums than they were about art fairs and galleries. So you learn a lot from the younger generation, for sure. And as a scholar of Iran, I started teaching Middle Eastern history in the United States in the 80s. And I started teaching art and cinema precisely because what Mitra was saying, that art and cinema becomes a document that you can use to teach Iran in a different way than other kind of political documents where there's much more mistranslation between the two cultures. Like cinema and art allows for a more global dialogue about the kinds of things that Iranians and Americans both have to live with. So I know we have a group of very knowledgeable and interested people in the audience, so if there's any questions, comments from the floor, we're happy to take them.
Hidya, you still have a question.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Thanks for all of your very valuable and interesting conversations so far. I'm wondering how his work has influenced sort of the next generation, because there's such a wide reach in all the different parts of the world. If there's younger artists, in all these places who are influenced by his work, and what the influence is.
Well, this is interesting because when I was giving a talk at Art Dubai years ago, and I had a slide of Farhad Moshiri, and the audience there was very like, oh, he's more popular in Dubai than he is in Iran, and he makes art for the Dubai market, because they were kind of a little bit cynical about how successful he is in Dubai. And I anticipated that they were going to make that comment. So I'd actually gone on social media and found dozens of pictures of young Iranian artists posing with Farhad Moshiri paintings. And they would post it on Instagram and Facebook, like, he could do it, I can too, and maybe I can be as good as him one day. And so the fact that he has this success and is kind of talked about and seen and acquired outside of Iran becomes aspirational for some of the younger artists.
Yeah, and just to add to that, a lot of people are inspired by Andy Warhol, and I work there, but I love the fact that Warhol has so many aspects. He's an author, a filmmaker, a painter. He was involved with so many different other artists and culture in general. So when I think of pop art, popular culture, I just think of contemporary culture. And I think for a lot of young people that go to the Warhol Museum, they find inspiration. It's whether they like soup cans or they love screen tests, they'll find some element of Andy that they love or that inspires them, young artists. And now with this particular show, we don't collect non-Warhol artists. And so to introduce Moshiri we have a small Persian community in Pittsburgh, but to introduce Moshiri to a Pittsburgh audience, I think it's really aspirational for also the young students in Pittsburgh that see his work for the first time, that are not Iranian, and say, who is this artist?
That's really cool. I also really appreciate, Andy Warhol has these time capsules, and so on the floor of the museum where he exhibited his time capsules, you have his box from Iran. And I think that, we have this stereotypical view of, Andy Warhol went to Tehran and he went for the financial aspect, which is, I'm sure, true. And there are stories about how he complained about how it was too hot, which is probably true. And there are stories about how he loved that there was caviar in the hotel minibar, which I'm sure is true. But one thing that you
thought it was over the top, apparently.
Yeah. One thing that you see, because he was part of that whole kind of Iranian embassy and party circuit, right? But one thing that you see in his time capsule, which I was really stunned by, is he saved everything. I mean, he has the menu from the airline. He has little letters that people wrote him. He stayed at the Hilton, like room 614 or something like that. The Tehran Hilton was one of the first international Hiltons. It made an episode of Mad Men. And so he had like postcards that he collected from Tehran.
Name cards from the table.
Yeah. Exactly. So I think that he probably had a more substantive he seemed to really swallow up Tehran at that time. So I think I appreciate that aspect of your show too, is it lets us see another side to Warhol.
Yeah, and also Farhad's a collector, so he was collecting these, his wife's also an archaeologist, so he collects all these vessels and jars, and he collects those knives, the knife paintings. I think a lot of them are from a town called Zanjan, I think, and they're known for their blades, but then there's mass-produced cheap blades, domestic blades. But yeah, Farhad is also a collector.
The knives he collects in any country he's in, the work wherever, So.
But Andy was also a collector, so.
I do have a question.
Oh.
There you go.
Wait for the mic.
This is Hediye Shafi, an excellent artist who, like Farhad, kind of bridges Iran and America.
I'm finding this conversation incredibly. I'm sorry?
You have to speak into the mic.
Oh, sorry. I'm finding this conversation really timely for me personally and very exciting because I first saw Farhad's large body of work in Dubai at the Farjam collection. And it was really shocking to me, and I didn't understand quite well why until some time passed. But I think this is something you guys really hit on today, which is what I realized over time is that very specific political messages are absent from the work. And I think from being from the region, there is this pressure as an artist that you feel like you have to somehow, make work that comments on the politics. And there's a lot of relevant work happening that artists do that does that. But I found myself also in this category that I didn't want to necessarily make political work. Although all art, I think in general, is political. Being an artist is political. I mean, these days being a human is political. But what's really fascinating for me is how he's managed to do that in his practice. And the question is, for me, that even though he's managed to do this in his practice, he still has to be labeled one thing or another. And I understand labels. It puts us in categories, and we can talk about them, whether it is the isms or styles of methods of working. But then there is, when you're an artist from a particular region, whether you are from Latin America, or if you're from Africa, you're from Middle East, you might have an inclination to use your own language, which is most familiar to you, as a graphic element in your work. And I find that sometimes doing that, you're immediately labeled as, an artist from that particular region, or for us in the Middle East, Islamic. And I want to, pose this question to anyone on the panel who wants to speak to it, but how do contemporary artists who are simply making work from their heart and responding with language that is maybe their first learned language or symbology that is particular to their background, deal with those labels and how important or problematic those labels can be?
Farhad's label's always been like, the commercial success he's had has always almost been, a sort of a weight on him because he's always been known as the artist who made $1 million, the first one who made $1 million. But then also, he was always labeled as the Koons of Iran or the Warhol of Iran, which, funny enough, then another artist did a work, Leila Pazouki, about, I don't know if you saw that, but she did this whole thing about Dali of Bali, Warhol of Iran. That was based on that comment. But, that's just, I guess it's an Orientalist approach to his work. But at the same time, for him, it was a very conscious decision not to work on the politics. So even though the piece earlier that we had in the slideshow where you had the crown and Khomeini in a heart, it's very interesting because in the context of translating images, a lot of people would see that work and they're like, oh, that's so Damien Hirst. And I'm like, actually, no. He took that from, a notebook that he found of a little girl in school, went in a secondhand store, and he was just recording what he saw without necessarily taking a stand. And he was criticized for that. When the Green Revolution happened, there was a fellow artist who actually said, he's almost not doing his duty as an artist.
I actually think his art is very political. It's just not the kind of politics that is expected. It doesn't look Iranian, his politics, right? Because he's talking about global economies, he's talking about perceptions of images, he's talking about, what counts as West, what counts as East, he's talking about the market. So his work is actually political, but in a much more kind of he shows
global,
there's a more diverse kind of politics to
It's also the ambiguity in his work. You know, he never reveals the source, and you know, that's really important in his work, because you don't know if you want to assume that it's American, or you want to label or categorize. And Farhad was very sensitive to being labeled a pop artist, and so, you know, for us to do the show, you know, we wanted to show his range, you know, and not label him as just a Middle Eastern artist or just a pop artist, because he's really diverse, just as Andy was.
So in that way, he's perfectly political in the way that all art is political, because all art is made at a moment in history, in a place in the world, and to be alive as a human is political. Yeah. But in that way that he's really keen about the market as a global phenomenon, he will work both in Persian, his first language. He'll make works in Arabic, which to an audience who speaks Arabic, or to an audience that speaks Persian, is abundantly clear that it's either their language or not their language. And then he'll make works that have in English. And so he's working very intentionally in different languages as a way of signaling that he's speaking to different market audiences and different cultural audiences.
Which is very much part of the history of contemporary American art. You know, Cy Twombly, Rauschenberg, you know, they used Arabic texts, you know, from their Moroccan years, you know, if you go and see. So it's not, so if you think of it as a textual, inscriptive kind of notion, and I think that, and we're going to wrap up here, I'm getting this time to wrap things up, so I'm, as moderator, I'm going to wrap up a little bit, but I think one of the things about Farhad that we should remember is that before he became big as an artist, not only did he study at Cal Arts, but he used to curate small shows of Iranian art in New York back in the late 90s when Iranian art was still being introduced to the global market. So he's always been very mindful of the way art is exhibited and seen and understood. So he has kind of a scholarly, curatorial approach to making art, which I think is one of the reasons why his art translates so well across different mediums and cultures. So thank you all very much.
The exhibition is still on view. The exhibition is up, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, till January 14th. Please come see the show.
Please come browse
and we have a catalog as well. Thank you.